Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second 2021 FMC Tech Talks webinar titled Soil Water Fundamentals and the Impact on Herbicides. My name is Frances Boddy. I'm the Eastern Canada Product Manager for FMC, and I'll also be your MC for this morning. The FMC Tech Talks series is a new venture for FMC Canada, and we're very happy that you're able to be here with us. FMC Tech Talks is an education-based platform that is product agnostic and will cover all aspects, actives, brands, and companies that participate in Eastern agriculture. We're lucky to have two presenters from FMC with us today. Rachel Evans is our first presenter and is the FMC Technical Sales Agronomist for Southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Rachel holds a Master's of Plant Science from the University of Manitoba. She brings her strong academic and consulting background in the areas of agroecology and soil science to help provide solutions for FMC farm customers. Our second presenter this morning is Allison Hayward. Allison is FMC's Field Development Biologist in Eastern Canada and manager of our Southern Ontario Research Station. She holds a PhD in plant physiology from Trent University with a focus on plant plasticity and adaptation. Allison uses that understanding of plant physiology to support the development of new FMC crop protection products. With that, I will pass the baton over to Rachel and Allison to talk soil and water.
All right, thanks, Frances, and good morning, everybody, from my frigid Winnipeg, Manitoba. So for today's webinar, we are going to cover how soil texture affects water movement and retention, and try and relate that back to how that is impacting your soil-applied herbicide. And we'll be going through a few scenarios that will hopefully show why this is relevant for your farm or your customers. So before we begin, I just want to make clear that there are a number of factors that are impacting the availability of soil-applied herbicides. There are factors associated with the soil, so things like texture and moisture, pH, organic matter, as well as factors associated with the herbicide itself. Its solubility, its absorption, it's the herbicide rate that we're using, its decomposition pathways. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so laying some foundations on soil texture and its impact on water movement and retention. And then Allison is going to take over as we connect their influence to soil-applied herbicides. Okay, so before we get started, let's just go back to Soils 101 here, and this should be probably very familiar for a lot of folks, but we're going to start here. So a soil's texture is classified based on the percentage of sand, silt, and clay particles. And we know that soils are rarely uniform. They are usually some combination of these three particle sizes. You might recognize some of these names on our soil texturing triangle, which is how we classify soils in Canada, things like clay loam, sandy loam, silt loam. And all this is referring to is the proportion of these three particle separates. And so each of these, sand, silt, and clay, are characterized differently, and that's based on their size. So starting from the right, sand particles, they're the largest, and so when we arrange them, that means that they have a low surface area and large pore space, or the gap between individual sand particles. Silts are a medium particle size, which means that they're characterized by a medium pore space and surface area. And then finally, clays are the smallest particle, meaning that when they are arranged on top of one another, they have very small pore spaces and very high surface area. And so these smaller particles, the clay particles, they are really playing a huge influencing factor on creating more binding sites for things like nutrients and, in this case, herbicides. So often we tend to simplify this by just referring to soil as fine, medium, or coarse textured, where fine soils are going to be those that have higher proportions of clay, so those really small particles. Medium is going to be soils that are higher in silts, so those medium particle size, and then coarse is going to be those soil types that are higher in sand. All right, poll time. What type of soil do you and your customers predominantly work with? Please select one. So use your mouse on your screen and we want to hear back from you. Fine, medium, coarse, or a little bit of everything. We'll give you a few minutes here. All right. And looks like, and probably as we would expect to see, 57% of folks are working with a little bit of everything. So a little bit of fine, a little bit of medium, and a little bit of coarse textured. All right. So let's get into some of these principles now. So the ability of water to influence so many soil processes is due primarily to the chemical structure of the water molecule. So the fact that water forms a V shape means that water molecules have a positive side where the hydrogen cations are, and a negative side where the oxygen is. So when you put soil into water, the hydrogens are attracted to the negatively charged soil particle, and they bind through something called a hydrogen bond. So all those little hydrogens around the exterior of our soil particle here, those are bound to the soil particle through a hydrogen bond. And this process is called adhesion. And while water is attracted to the solid, it's also attracted to itself. And this process is called cohesion. So cohesion is the reason why water has a relatively high surface tension. For example, when you see a water bug moving across a pond, its feet look like it's pushing down into water. There's resistance there. And that's because water is more attracted to itself than it is to the surrounding air. So broadly speaking, the ability for soil to retain water is the result of adhesion, attraction of water to the soil, and cohesion, attraction of water to itself. And so picture a field after it's rained. What's driving the movement of water in soil? And there's three main forces that are at work. The first is pretty obvious, and that's the overall downward pull that gravity has on water moving into soil. The second is the attraction of water to soil itself. And this is given the overarching name capillary action or matrix force. And you can think of this as wicking or suction. So our example here in this picture of the colored water moving up into the paper towel. And I'm going to be going into this in a bit more detail in the coming slides. And then lastly is the force that the soil solution is having. And we won't be covering this in a lot of detail today, but this is essentially the attraction that water has for other ions like salts. And so this doesn't have a lot of impact on mass movement, but it does impact water uptake in plant roots. So for example, how soil salinity reduces the uptake of water in plants. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into capillary action. And this is a really important principle to understand, as it really is, largely determines how water is moving and is retained in soil. Again, you have those two forces at work, the attraction of water to the soil, adhesion, and the attraction of water to itself, cohesion. And so this graph here is showing capillary rise in centimeters over time from three different soil types. So imagine a layer of sand over a basin of free water, a layer of loamy sand over a basin of free water, and a layer of clay loam over a basin of free water. And so if we start with the sand, that blue line, you can see that the rise in sand starts very quickly. So we go up to just over 20 centimeters in a very short amount of time. And however, it stops, right? It levels off. And that's because the large particle size and the large pore space in the sand means that there's less suction or less attractive forces pulling that water up. In contrast, if we look at the red line or the gray line, the loamy sand and the clay loam, you can see that the height of rise is greater in these soil types because of the smaller pore spaces. There's greater pull, greater attraction to those smaller particle sizes. And so the height of rise is greater, but it also is slower. So that's another distinguishing factor here, right? Is that it takes longer for that rise to occur. And so if water is moving in response to really two major forces, capillary action and gravity, we also have to consider that the moisture status of the soil at any given time is also going to impact water movement. And this is characterized three ways. So in our first scenario, starting on the left, is when, and is a scenario called saturated flow. And so this is when all of our soil pores, large and small, are full of water. So in saturated soils, water will begin to drain out of the large pores first, again, because of the less surface area, lower adhesion. And so gravity is able to take hold and move the water downwards. And this is sometimes called gravitational water. And then after all of the water has moved out of the large pores, what happens next is called unsaturated flow. So now the large pore spaces are filled with air, leaving only our smaller pore spaces to hold and transmit water. And this is what's happening most of the time. So here you have gravity at work, but you also have the matrix forces at work, because now there's more, all of that gravitational water is moved out, and it's really just the capillary action that now is pulling and moving that water further. And then lastly, it's vapor movement, and this occurs in really dry soils, not really involved in the mass flow of water. So aside from mentioning it here, I won't be going into a ton more detail. All right, so this picture really shows us well how soil type can influence water movement. So pretend, I don't know if you can see there, our little pumps at the soil surface. So pretend that a pump has pumped the same amount of water onto the surface of three soil types: our clay, our loam, and our sand. And a few things jump out here. First is that the depth that the water is reaching. So studies have shown that it can take twice as long in the clay than it does in the sand for the same amount of water to percolate downwards to the same soil depth. And this is again because in sand soils, water is moving more freely with gravity downwards because of those larger particles, the larger pore spaces. There's less attraction for water to the soil itself. And so another way of saying this is that sand has a higher saturated conductivity than clay. Secondly, you can see in the clay or in the loam that there's more horizontal movement, and that's because there's more capillary action pulling the water laterally, as well as gravity pushing it downwards. And so the path that water takes is more concentrated in our sand soils than in our clay or our loam soils. So in a practical world, though, we know that soils are not uniform. We often, and as seen in your responses to our poll earlier, that we can go from, fields that are clay loams to silty clays or sandy clays, but soils also vary in how they're layered. And how does that impact water movement? So let's say, for example, we have a fine textured loam in our A horizon here, and that is sitting on top of a coarse sand in our E horizon. So we go to the next slide. So in this example, you might expect that the sand layer is going to speed up water movement downwards because sand soils have a higher saturated flow, right, Rachel? But in this scenario, it actually has the opposite effect. So those larger pore spaces have less attraction, less suction than the finer loam in that A horizon, which means that as water starts to move downwards, it effectively stops moving at that E horizon. And so it's not until that A horizon is completely filled with water that it becomes saturated and that the water is so loosely held that gravity is able to take hold and continue to move it downwards. And this is the same principle that explains why the weeping tile in your basement, so the coarse gravel that they layer in around your basement foundation, prevents water from moving up. And it's the same reason, right? So it's preventing water from moving down in this scenario, but it also can prevent water from moving up. All right, so to pull this all together, let's go back to our soil examples here. So we've got our sand soil on the left and our clay soil on the right. And I'm just going to walk through these diagrams. So working from the right, in both cases, when soils are saturated, water is loosely held against the pull of gravity and it's able to move downwards. So water is going to move more quickly out of the sand than in the clay because of less adhesion and larger soil particles. And after all of the gravitational is percolated downwards, what remains is the water held by soil particles. And this is also known as capillary water. And now our large pore spaces are filled with air. So when we have capillary water and our large pore spaces are filled with air, at this point we're said to be at field capacity. Remember, plant roots need air too. And so, at that point, as water, we keep moving from right to left, water is used up by plants, it slowly moves downward, and eventually you get to what's called the permanent wilting point. So here water is so tightly held by the soil particles that plant roots can't access it. And this is also called hygroscopic water. So the difference between field capacity and wilting point is called plant available water. So this is all the water that's freely accessible to plant roots for uptake. And generally speaking, when we have finer textured soils, they tend to have higher capacity to hold water, again, because of those smaller particle sizes, greater surface area, more attraction, and so therefore they're said to have more plant available water than our sandy soils. All right, poll time. Let's see how well you were listening or how well I explained that. The difference between field capacity and the permanent wilting point is called hygroscopic water, plant available water, gravitational water, or all of the above. Give you a couple more seconds here. 71% plant available water. All right, that is the correct answer.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, I'm Allison, and I am now going to talk to you a bit more about soil-applied herbicides and how they relate to soil texture and soil water. So now that we have a clear understanding of soil texture influences on soil moisture and water movement, let's talk about some key aspects of the herbicides themselves that also affect their availability in the soil. So I'm going to talk about solubility and adsorption, though there are a number of other factors that would play a role. For the sake of time, we're just going to focus in on these two concepts. So let's first talk about solubility. So what solubility is the amount of herbicide that will dissolve in water. Herbicides have a range of solubilities, and various environmental conditions can affect the solubility of a given herbicide in the soil. This can potentially increase or decrease the amount of herbicide that goes into solution. And a good example of this is soil pH. So I'm not going to go into too much detail regarding pH. This is a whole other topic. Perhaps it'll be an FMC Tech Talk in the future. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the soil pH has a greater effect on some herbicides than it does on others. So particularly the solubility of weak acids and weak bases are affected by the soil pH. So the next concept that we're going to talk about is adsorption, which is the physical binding of a herbicide to the soil particles. More specifically, herbicides bind to soil colloids, which are made up of clay and organic matter. So the more clay and organic matter in a soil, the more binding locations or binding sites are present to bind up a herbicide or adsorb to. When a herbicide comes off a soil colloid and goes back into solution, it's called desorption. So going from solution to binding to a soil colloid, clay and organic matter is adsorption. Going back into solution is desorption. So herbicides have differing adsorption abilities, which is expressed as their adsorption coefficient, or KOC. It sounds complicated because it has the word coefficient, but what it really is simply the amount on the soil compared to the amount in water. So a herbicide with a low KOC or a low adsorption coefficient is dissolved in the soil solution more than it's bound to the soil, compared to a herbicide with a high KOC, which has a greater portion of it bound to the soil. Generally, you could say that the solubility and adsorption are inversely related, in that herbicides with low solubilities would likely have high adsorption coefficients. However, in actuality, there are many herbicides that do not follow this and have low water solubility and low KOCs, or they'll have high water solubility and high KOCs. This is just a small chart with some examples of active ingredients common in Eastern Canada. And you can see that the inverse relationship doesn't necessarily hold true, but generally speaking, they are sort of opposite concepts of each other. So I want to tie this back into soil texture and soil moisture. So looking back at our soil texture categories, we have our fine, medium, and coarse soils. We can see that the characteristics of these soil types have a strong impact on the water holding capacity and availability of soil applied herbicides. So fine textured soils have small pore spaces and small particle sizes. They have high water holding capacity and high absorption potentials because of their high clay content. Whereas sandier, coarse textured soils have large pore spaces, low water holding capacity, and lower absorption abilities. Layering on this, the solubilities and adsorption coefficients of herbicides themselves, you can see that this is where we could run into issues. For example, the probability of leaching in coarse sandy soils is further increased if a highly soluble herbicide is used. And the likelihood of a herbicide being tied up in fine textured soils is increased if a herbicide with a high absorption coefficient is used. So putting this all together, let's go through the two steps that need to happen for a soil applied herbicide to be effective. So step one, after herbicides applied to the soil surface, there needs to be a rain event or irrigation applied to dissolve the herbicide and get it into solution. The herbicide is then able to move with the soil downward into the soil profile. So step two is once the soil herbicide has moved into the soil, it starts to come into equilibrium with the soil colloids and the soil solution. This is where the herbicide starts to adsorb and desorb on and off of the soil particles and in and out of solution. And this equilibrium process can take up to 3 days. The equilibrium that is reached is dependent on all the factors we've discussed so far: soil texture, water availability, herbicide solubility and adsorption coefficients, and on many other factors that we're not able to discuss today, such as pH, organic matter, and temperature. So now that we have formed this active layer, the herbicide is ready to prevent weed emergence. For the last part of this presentation, I wanted to walk through 2 real-life scenarios. These are things that we may have witnessed in the field when using soil-applied residual herbicides, and I want to use some of the information we discussed today to look at what might be going on in these situations. So the first scenario is weed escapes. This is something that does happen from time to time, and there are many reasons why it may occur. In this discussion, we're just going to try to focus on the key factors we have talked about, but it should be acknowledged that there are numerous other factors likely at work here. In this scenario, we have a field with some weed escapes. In this case, it's primarily common ragweed. And here's the information that we know about this field. They received 1/4 to a 1/2 inch of rain a few days after application. It's a conventional tilled field. It's with 3.5% organic matter. It's a clay loam soil type. And we know that there was low moisture prior to the application of the herbicide. When thinking about this field, we need to consider a few key things: the herbicide used, the rate and the rate applied, the tillage practices in the field, the soil type, and the soil moisture at application. Here I have ideally what we would like to have happened. We want the herbicide to move down into the soil profile to a depth of approximately the weed seed location. We want it to stay here, we want it to go into soil solution, and we want it to be available to these weed seeds when they germinate. In this scenario, there may have been some weed escapes because the herbicide did not move deep enough into the soil profile. Soil texture is, the soil texture here was a clay loam, and the soil was very dry prior to application, potentially at its wilting point. In this situation, the small rain that did fall would have minimal downward flow, so it would not move the herbicide very deep into the soil profile. There also would have been minimal water in the soil profile to allow the herbicide to be in solution, and there's a lot of absorption sites in clay soils, so tie-up of the herbicide was probably fairly extensive. Additionally, the conventional tillage practices in the field would have pushed the weed seeds lower into the profile, exacerbating this issue. In this situation would have been made worse if the herbicide used had a low solubility and a high adsorption coefficient. So in the second scenario, once again, we're going to talk about weed escapes. But this time we're talking about weed escapes where the weed started to show herbicide damage. And this is sometimes called reachback. Depending on the level of injury, these weeds may die, or they may at the very least be stunted and more susceptible to an in-crop herbicide application. So what we know about this field when this happened, we know that there was an extended dry period after application, about 2.5 weeks before they received an inch of rain. The organic matter was a little under 3%, and it was a sandy loam soil. Once again, we want to think about our ideal situation, and we want to consider some key things about this field: the rain event following the application, the soil type, and the herbicide stability. And I know we haven't talked about herbicide stability in this presentation, but it does play an important role in these reachback events, so I'm going to mention it here. In this scenario, what has likely occurred is that the herbicide sat on the surface after the application and didn't move downwards into the soil profile because there was no rain for 2.5 weeks. During this time, if the herbicide was photostable, meaning it did not get broken down by the sunlight and it has a low volatility, it will just sit there waiting for soil moisture to solubilize it and move it into the soil. Also, unfortunately, during this 2.5 weeks, it took to get a good rain, some weeds germinated. Once the rain finally came, the herbicide was able to move down into the soil profile, and it formed its active layer. As the weed roots moved down into the soil, they encountered this newly activated soil herbicide and started to take up the herbicide, leading to herbicide damage. The fact that the soil type was sandy loam with a moderate organic matter allowed the herbicide to be readily available and the weeds once the rain activated the herbicide. So when it comes to soil applied herbicides, there are a number of factors that you need to pay attention to. From what we learned today, it's important to pay attention to soil type, soil moisture, and the solubility and adsorption coefficients of herbicides themselves.
Thank you, Rachel and Allison. Lots to take in. I know how my own clay soil reacts to water, and it's really interesting to hear, the whys behind it. Very interesting. Again, to the audience, if you have any questions, you can click on the question mark or in the chat button and type it in. And we do have a question for you from the chat currently. The question is, how are herbicides affected in peat soils?
And so I can take that one, Francis. So peat soils, and I apologize if my Manitoba-ness shines through here, so bear with me. But peat soils are generally characterized by being very high in organic matter. And so as we have gone through today, organic matter and clay particles are both responsible for creating binding sites for herbicides. And so if you are working with a chemistry that has a high KOC, or it has a high potential to bind to these organic or clay particles, that you would be potentially looking at a scenario where you could see reduced efficacy because of having this greater scenario for binding. So I would encourage you to consider what chemistry you're working with, and what are the restrictions with that chemistry. And if you don't know, I'm sure there's lots of people out there who can help find that information for you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Just looking at the chat right now, at this point in time, we don't appear to have any more questions. I'll give it a couple of seconds, but again, if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, or alternatively, if you think of a burning question as we're finalizing the webinar, feel free to enter it into the chat, and we can respond to you offline, just directly back to get you an answer. Oh, we do have one more question in the chat. What kind of adjustments would we make when spraying across a variable field? So a field that has more than one soil type. Do we spray to the highest rate of the soil type, or do you go lower?
I can answer that one, I guess, Allison, if you want, but feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in if I need to.
Okay. And so I guess in that scenario, I would be, great question, first of all, and we definitely see that coming across in all across Canada, right? Is we know that soils are variable, and we know that oftentimes we're working with soil applied herbicides that have a rate structure based on these different soil parameters. And so I would just, I think if you have the capacity to do variable rate, then that's a great opportunity. I think it's something that probably needs to be talked more of in ag when working with these herbicides. So having the capabilities to adjust your rate based on soil type as you're traveling across the field. If you don't have the ability to adjust your rate, then I would be, working within the restrictions of your chemistry. So I definitely would be, paying attention to your rate, so that you were not putting yourself in a scenario where you would be at higher risk, and making sure that you based on the percentage of your field that was in within sort of the range that you are looking for, that you're also not going to be sacrificing weed control either. But it can be a bit of a balancing act, and I'm sure asking a few more questions and probably would help to know exactly the soil characteristics and exactly the chemistry that you're working with to be able to kind of flush that out further.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Another question from the chat. Is the absorption or solubility listed on the label?
That's a great question. I believe it's not, and Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's not, but it's a very common number, a quick Google search of the active ingredients, and you can obtain that information. But as a warning for this presentation, we did purposefully simplify the situation. There's a lot more interactions. There's different solubilities and different adsorption coefficients based on temperature and pHs, and so you might get a range. It's what the herbicide could be much more available in colder temperatures or warmer temperatures or higher or lower pHs. So there's also that to take into account, but those numbers are available just with a Google search of the active ingredients.
Thank you, Allison. Another question here. It's a follow-up from the peat soil question. Are there any herbicides that you would suggest for a peat soil?
Well, I'm not going to make
product specific.
I was going to say, I'm not going to make any product recommendations here and now. There are commonly organic matter restrictions or soil type restrictions on soil applied herbicide labels for the reasons that Rachel already discussed with regards to peat soil. But that's something we can take offline and have a conversation with the person who asked. But I don't want to name names in this presentation.
Fair enough. Thanks, Allison. One more question here in the chat. Effects of corn stubble cover on rates of herbicide and spray water volume.
Excellent question. Rachel, do you want to start answering this one, just because out in the prairies you deal more with no-till than I probably deal with on a regular basis?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this kind of relates, or there's the answer depends on what chemistry you're talking about here. There are certainly some chemistries that are more likely to get temporarily bound up in that stubble more quickly than others. And so without going, product by product, generally speaking, I know from our portfolio anyways, that there's been lots of literature and lots of research that's been done in places like Australia, for example, that's been working with these soil applied chemistries for a long time, and has shown that, with rainfall, that it does move off of trash and into the soil. The one caveat is that if you have any bunching or any areas that it's really thick trash, I'm talking like a big clod type of thing, then yes, that is going to likely, impact the ability for the chemistry to make its way down into the soil. But for the average field, and an evenly distributed trash, that we don't see that playing a role. And considering that areas of Saskatchewan, for example, that have been in minimum tillage for 30 years, it's not a concern from our perspective, anyways.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today to learn about soil water fundamentals and impact on herbicides. Please consider joining us for our next FMC Tech Talk in the series titled Information from Our Neighbors. Have a great rest of your day.